Greetings, this is Dr. Fleming. I want to take the opportunity just to share with you for a few minutes regarding the evaluating of context. In your week two assignment, in part two, you were to select 3 different parables and answer a series of questions. And those questions were things like, where was Jesus when he told this parable? Who was his audience? Did he also explain the parable? And so as we evaluate context, a couple of things that I want you to keep in mind is that on many occasions, the setting or the context will not be always found directly within that particular pericope of scripture. There are times when you will have to read the chapter ahead or the previous chapter or the beginning of the chapter, or maybe even you will find some of the context toward the end of the chapter or in the following chapter. But a rule of thumb, in order to evaluate the context of a particular passage of scripture, is to go ahead and read the entire chapter and plus the chapters before and after. There are some occasions where you may have to read a couple of chapters prior to that particular passage of scripture in order to get a grasp of the context of a particular pericope of scripture. So I'm going to take this opportunity as well just to show you. I use a software called Logos. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's spelled Logos. It is a very great tool to use for researching biblical information. So let me go ahead and just share my screen with you. Okay, so this is Logos. So one of the scripture passages that we looked at was actually Matthew chapter 18, the scripture in regards to Jesus talking about the parable of the lost sheep. So that is found in the Gospel of Matthew, verses 10, around verse 10. So if we look at it here, it says, "Take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones, for I say unto you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven. For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost. How think ye, if a man have 100 sheep, and one of them be gone astray, doth he not leave the 99 and goeth into the mountains and seeketh that which is gone astray?" So in this particular passage of scripture, when you also try to evaluate the context or the background or the setting, you may want to caution yourself to not always look at another book where you find a similar story, but just try to stay within the book, try to stay within the context of the chapter or the particular passage of scripture that you're looking at, and I'll show you why. In this particular case here, you can also find this same parable being told in the Gospel of Luke. And so it can be easily assumed that Jesus is, or this is the same parable as in Luke, but technically speaking, it appears that Jesus has actually told this parable twice. And so when we evaluate the context or the background, you'll see why I make this statement. So for example, in this particular passage, Jesus's audience, it says here, "Take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones." In this particular passage, he's talking about children, okay? If you go and read toward the beginning of chapter 18, it says, "At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him and set him in the midst of them." So as he begins to speak and you answer the question, who is Jesus's audience? Based on this particular passage, Jesus's audience are the disciples and a little child. He could be referencing other children as well, but technically speaking, as we relate to this particular passage, as Jesus tells this parable, his audience is a child and his disciples. So when you answer the question, well, where were they? If you go ahead and go back to the previous chapter, chapter 17, verse 24, and it says, and when they were come to Capernaum, that they received tribute money, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, does not your master pay tribute? He said, yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, so in essence, if you look at location, particularly in this passage, is they could be at a house somewhere in Capernaum, but as time progressed, we don't know specifically, but just based on the passage we're looking at here, they're somewhere in the area of Capernaum, because as he begins to speak, he says, at the same time came the disciples to Jesus, saying, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So we have a potential place. We also have the particular audience, and Jesus is telling this parable of the lost sheep. So when you look at this passage also in the Gospel of Luke, I'm going to go to it real quick. Luke 15, verses 4 through 7. So this is the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. It says, what man of you having 100 sheep, if you lose one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after one, after that which is lost until he finds it? So basically somewhat of the same parable, but strong possibility that he's telling this parable to a completely different audience on a separate occasion. And so if you go to the beginning of chapter 15 in the Gospel of Luke, you find these words, verse 1, then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him, and the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, this man receiveth sinners and eateth with them. And he spake this parable unto them. So basically, what man of you having 100 sheep, if you lose one? So somewhat of the same parable. So there's a strong possibility that he's telling this parable twice. So that is why it's very important to look at the overall context of a particular passage. You're going to have also in week 4, this week, a similar assignment, a different set of questions, but the same principles apply when it comes to evaluating the context of a particular passage of scripture and trying to answer various questions regarding where was Jesus, who was his audience, what is the message being conveyed, those types of things. So I enjoy taking this journey with you. You all are doing a wonderful job. If you do have any questions regarding any of the assignments, please do not hesitate to ask. Take care and have a great evening.